He was a billionaire who could buy anything, except the truth. So, he disguised himself as a poor gatekeeper to test his son's fiancée. But what she said to him at the gate left him in tears. Edward Kane had built his empire from nothing, brick by brick, deal by deal, until he became one of the most powerful men in the city. His name opened doors, his wealth commanded respect, and his love for his only son, Ryan, was unmatched. But when Ryan introduced Amelia, a stunning young woman with a smile that seemed too perfect, Edward felt a flicker of unease. She was charming, polite, and seemed to adore Ryan, yet something about her felt rehearsed. In the back of his mind, a nagging question grew louder each day: was her love for Ryan real, or was it wrapped in the glitter of his fortune? That night, as the rain tapped against the wide glass windows of his study, Edward decided he needed answers, not from rumors or investigations, but from Amelia herself. However, the truth wouldn't come if she knew who he was. So he envisioned a plan that would strip away the influence of his money and title. He would disappear behind a disguise, trading his tailored suits for a faded gatekeeper's uniform, trading polished shoes for worn boots, and hiding his face beneath a cap pulled low. No one would know the billionaire was standing at the gates of his own mansion. If Amelia was genuine, she would show kindness to a man with nothing to offer her. If she wasn't, her mask would crack. The thought was unsettling, even painful, but Edward's heart needed certainty. This wasn't just about Ryan's happiness. It was about protecting him from a love that might turn to poison. And so, with a heavy but determined heart, Edward Kane set his plan into motion, unaware that the truth he was about to uncover would change all their lives forever. The morning of the test dawned crisp and cool, the mansion still wrapped in shadows as Edward stood before a mirror he barely recognized. Gone was the polished billionaire with the silver cufflinks and Italian suit. In his place stood an aging man in a faded navy uniform, its edges frayed and buttons dulled with time. His hair was hidden beneath a worn cap, and a thin layer of dust streaked across his face, softening the sharp lines of his jaw. He even traded his watch, a timepiece worth more than most people's yearly salary, for an old scratched one that barely ticked. He stepped into scuffed boots and picked up a small metal stool, the kind a tired gatekeeper might rest on between shifts. By the time the staff arrived, Edward was already at the gates, leaning casually against the iron bars as though he had always belonged there. Amelia was due to arrive that afternoon, unaware of the eyes that would be watching her so closely. Hours crawled by, the sun climbing higher as Edward greeted delivery drivers and waved to neighbors, his voice rougher than usual, his manner humble. But beneath the disguise, his mind raced with questions. What would she say? How would she look at him, with kindness, indifference, or disdain? The clink of heels on the cobblestone driveway finally pulled him from his thoughts. Amelia appeared, her designer coat catching the light, her phone in one hand and a sleek purse in the other. She glanced toward the gates, her expression unreadable. Edward straightened, heart thudding as the moment he had planned for finally arrived. This was it. The first step in uncovering the truth about the woman who might one day become his daughter-in-law. Amelia slowed her pace as she reached the gates, her eyes briefly sweeping over the uniformed man standing there. Edward kept his head slightly bowed, letting his voice come out in a low, almost weary tone. "Good afternoon, miss," he said, offering a small nod. She barely glanced at him at first, her attention fixed on the gleaming mansion beyond. "I'm here to see Alexander," she said briskly, her tone clipped. "You'll have to wait a moment," Edward replied, as though following some strict protocol. "The family's busy inside, and I'm under instructions not to let anyone in without clearance." For a heartbeat, Amelia's brows knit together, and a flicker of irritation crossed her face. "Do you know who I am?" she asked, a sharp edge creeping into her voice. Edward nodded. "Yes, miss. But rules are rules." The words hung in the air, testing her patience. She sighed, tapping her heel against the stone, and muttered something under her breath he couldn't quite catch, but it didn't sound kind. When he asked her to wait outside the gates for a few minutes, she stepped back with visible annoyance, folding her arms and pulling her coat tighter. Edward noticed the subtle curl of her lip when she glanced toward the stool he was using, as if the sight of it bothered her. He studied every movement, every expression, feeling a weight settle in his chest. Not once did she ask how he was, or even offer a polite smile. Instead, she stood apart, eyes on her phone, occasionally exhaling impatiently. By the time the gates finally opened, Edward already had the beginnings of an answer to his question, and it wasn't the one he had hoped for. Still, he knew the real test had yet to come. Later that afternoon, Edward decided to deepen the test. He waited by the gate again, but this time, the weather had shifted. A light drizzle misted the air, dampening his old uniform and making the cold seep into his bones. Amelia arrived in a sleek car, stepping out under an expensive umbrella. She eyed him quickly, her voice carrying a hint of impatience. "Why are you still here? Can't you just open the gate?" Edward explained that Alexander had stepped out unexpectedly, and that she might have to wait for nearly an hour. Her reaction was immediate, a frustrated sigh, a shake of the head, and a glance back at her car as though debating whether to leave. "This is ridiculous," she murmured, checking her phone and pacing in small, agitated steps. Edward coughed lightly, partly from the chill, but she didn't seem to notice. Instead, she called a friend, laughing and complaining about being stuck outside like some delivery driver. The words stung, each one revealing more than she realized. After some time, a delivery boy approached the gate, carrying a package and struggling with the rain. Amelia didn't offer to help, she simply stepped aside, holding her umbrella high to avoid the splash from the wet pavement. Edward's eyes softened with a trace of sadness. This wasn't about wealth or class anymore, it was about humanity, and she seemed to have forgotten hers. When the gates finally opened and she swept past him without a word, Edward knew the truth had surfaced. The woman his son loved might have beauty, style, and charm, but the warmth of kindness, the thing that mattered most, was missing. And now, Edward faced the painful decision of what to do next. The following morning, Edward shed the worn gatekeeper's uniform and dressed in his finest suit. His heart was heavy, but his mind was clear. He asked Alexander to invite Amelia over for lunch, insisting he wanted to meet her properly. When she arrived, stepping into the grand marble foyer, her eyes widened in awe. Edward stood at the top of the staircase, his presence commanding yet strangely familiar. "You," she whispered, her voice trembling as recognition flickered in her eyes. "The gatekeeper," Edward finished, his tone calm but weighted. Silence stretched between them before he spoke again. "I wanted to see how you treated someone you thought could give you nothing. What I saw broke me." Amelia's face paled. She tried to laugh it off, insisting she had been in a hurry, that it was all a misunderstanding. But Edward's gaze was steady, unwavering. Alexander's eyes darted between them, confusion turning to hurt as the truth sank in. "Love without kindness is no love at all," Edward said softly, his voice cracking. "You may have passed many tests in life, Amelia, but not the one that mattered." Tears filled his eyes, not for himself, but for his son, whose dream had just shattered. Amelia stood frozen, realizing there was nothing she could say to change what had been revealed. She turned, walking away in silence, her footsteps echoing in the grand hall. Edward placed a comforting hand on Alexander's shoulder. "Better a broken heart now," he murmured, "than a lifetime built on lies." They watched from the doorway as Amelia's figure disappeared beyond the gates. The drizzle returned, blurring the view, but Edward knew the truth had set them free. For the first time in years, the gates felt lighter when they closed.